In the aftermath of the Second World War and the rapid onset of superpower rivalry, the United States confronted a strategic problem unprecedented in its history: the possibility that a single surprise attack could decapitate civilian leadership, destroy military command, and paralyze the state in minutes, forcing the Pentagon to develop continuity of government and continuity of operations plans that assumed the near-total destruction of normal governance as a starting condition rather than an extreme contingency. These plans, later grouped under the informal label of Doomsday continuity planning, emerged gradually from early Cold War fears of Soviet bomber attacks and matured as nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles, and compressed warning times rendered traditional concepts of recovery obsolete. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, U.S. defense planners recognized that deterrence alone was insufficient if the government itself could not survive long enough to order retaliation or manage post-attack chaos, leading to a parallel strategic effort focused not on preventing war, but on ensuring institutional survival after it had already begun. Early continuity planning revolved around dispersal and redundancy, with executive branch agencies instructed to identify alternate headquarters, duplicate critical records, and establish chains of succession that could function even if Washington, D.C. were destroyed, reflecting a growing assumption that the capital would be a primary target in any nuclear exchange. The Pentagon, newly established as the nerve center of U.S. military power, became the coordinating hub for these efforts, integrating civilian leadership survival into broader war planning and embedding continuity assumptions into operational doctrine. As the Cold War intensified, continuity planning expanded beyond paperwork and succession charts into physical infrastructure, as hardened bunkers, underground command posts, and dispersed communication networks were constructed to house surviving leadership and maintain control over nuclear forces under apocalyptic conditions. These facilities were designed to operate autonomously, supplied with independent power, air filtration, and communications, and staffed by pre-designated personnel trained to function in isolation, underscoring the extent to which planners assumed that the outside world might be uninhabitable or unreachable for extended periods. The logic underpinning these plans was starkly utilitarian, prioritizing the survival of command authority over broader humanitarian considerations, and reflecting a belief that preserving the capacity to govern and retaliate was itself a form of deterrence, signaling to adversaries that no first strike could eliminate U.S. response. By the mid-1950s, continuity planning had become institutionalized within the Pentagon, coordinated through classified programs that linked the Department of Defense with the White House, intelligence agencies, and key civilian departments, creating a shadow architecture of governance designed to activate only under conditions of national annihilation. The advent of intercontinental ballistic missiles and thermonuclear weapons in the late 1950s and early 1960s dramatically intensified these efforts, as warning times shrank from hours to minutes, and the prospect of leadership survival in fixed locations became increasingly uncertain. In response, planners emphasized mobility and dispersion, developing airborne command posts, pre-arranged evacuation routes, and rapid relocation procedures intended to move senior officials away from target zones at the first indication of attack, even if confirmation remained uncertain. These measures reflected an acceptance that false alarms and ambiguous warnings were an unavoidable feature of the nuclear age, and that continuity plans might be activated under conditions of extreme uncertainty, potentially altering national decision-making in moments of crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 marked a critical inflection point in continuity planning, as the proximity of nuclear confrontation forced the Pentagon to test and refine evacuation procedures, command survivability, and communication resilience under real-world stress, revealing gaps between theoretical preparedness and practical execution. In the crisis's aftermath, continuity programs were expanded and refined, with greater emphasis placed on integrated command and control systems capable of linking dispersed leadership nodes with nuclear forces in real time, ensuring that authority could be exercised even if traditional hierarchies were disrupted. Throughout the 1960s, continuity planning evolved in parallel with broader strategic doctrine, incorporating assumptions about limited nuclear war, escalation control, and prolonged conflict, and rejecting earlier notions that nuclear war would be brief or singular in favor of scenarios involving extended operations under catastrophic conditions. This shift required continuity plans that could sustain governance not merely for hours or days, but potentially for weeks, demanding greater attention to logistics, personnel rotation, and psychological endurance within sealed environments. Secrecy remained a defining feature of these efforts, as public acknowledgement of detailed doomsday planning risked undermining confidence, provoking panic, or revealing vulnerabilities to adversaries, resulting in a continuity apparatus largely invisible to the population it was intended to govern. Within the Pentagon, continuity planning was treated as a grim necessity rather than a theoretical exercise, reinforced by intelligence assessments that emphasized Soviet targeting doctrine and the vulnerability of centralized leadership structures. By the early 1970s, continuity plans had become deeply embedded in Cold War governance, influencing how decisions were made, how exercises were conducted, and how authority was conceptualized under extreme conditions, even as détente and arms control introduced new rhetorical commitments to stability and restraint. The persistence of these plans reflected a core paradox of the Cold War, that efforts to reduce the likelihood of nuclear war coexisted with detailed preparations for governing its aftermath, and that strategic stability depended not only on preventing catastrophe, but on assuming its possibility as a baseline for planning. The Pentagon's Doomsday continuity programs thus reveal a hidden dimension of Cold War strategy, one in which survival of the state was treated as an operational problem to be solved through redundancy, secrecy, and institutional endurance, rather than as a moral or political question to be debated openly. These plans did not guarantee survival, nor did they promise recovery, but they embodied an acceptance that the legitimacy of authority in the nuclear age depended on its ability to persist, even after unimaginable destruction, shaping the architecture of U.S. defense planning for decades and embedding the assumption of catastrophe into the everyday functioning of Cold War governance. As continuity planning matured through the late Cold War, it increasingly reshaped how the Pentagon conceptualized command authority, crisis decision-making, and the relationship between civilian leadership and the military under conditions where constitutional norms might be impossible to observe in their traditional form, revealing how preparations for Doomsday blurred the boundary between emergency governance and permanent structural adaptation. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, continuity of government assumptions were no longer confined to hypothetical scenarios, but were embedded into routine exercises, war games, and alert procedures, ensuring that senior officials and military commanders internalized the expectation that normal governance could collapse with little warning. This institutionalization altered behavior in subtle but consequential ways, as evacuation triggers, succession protocols, and dispersal orders became operational variables in moments of tension, potentially influencing escalation dynamics by privileging survivability over deliberation. Within the Pentagon, continuity planning reinforced a centralized conception of authority, emphasizing the preservation of a narrow decision-making core capable of ordering nuclear operations, even if broader political consultation was impossible, a posture that reflected both technological constraints and a deep skepticism about the feasibility of collective governance after large-scale attack. These assumptions were reflected in the design of hardened command centers, which prioritized secure communication links to nuclear forces over accommodation of legislative or judicial functions, underscoring that continuity planning was fundamentally about sustaining the capacity to wage war rather than preserving democratic process. The B, selection and training of personnel assigned to continuity roles further revealed this hierarchy of priorities, as individuals were chosen not only for rank, but for perceived reliability under isolation, stress, and moral ambiguity, anticipating conditions in which decisions of enormous consequence might be made with minimal external validation. Exercises conducted under continuity scenarios routinely simulated the loss of Washington, D.C., the death of senior officials, and the severing of communication with civilian populations, normalizing the idea that governance might continue in a radically altered form, defined by secrecy, militarization, and constrained legitimacy. These simulations exposed persistent tensions between legal frameworks and practical necessity as planners confronted questions of succession validity, emergency authority, and the duration of extraordinary powers without clear constitutional guidance. Rather than resolving these dilemmas publicly, the Pentagon managed them through classified directives and internal agreements, accepting ambiguity as preferable to paralysis. Technological evolution further complicated continuity planning as advances in surveillance, early warning, and command and control both expanded and constrained options for leadership survival, enabling faster evacuation while simultaneously reducing decision time and increasing the risk that continuity measures could be triggered by false or ambiguous indicators. The proliferation of early warning systems in the 1970s heightened concern that continuity protocols might be activated prematurely, altering command arrangements in ways that could themselves become destabilizing. Yet, planners judged this risk acceptable compared to the possibility of decapitation. The existence of airborne command posts, designed to keep senior leadership aloft during crises, symbolized this logic, providing survivability at the cost of detachment from civilian institutions and reinforcing a model of governance optimized for command rather than consent. Continuity planning also intersected with alliance politics, as U.S. preparations implicitly assumed the capacity to continue war, even if allied governments were destroyed or incapacitated, raising unspoken questions about representation, legitimacy, and the management of coalition warfare after catastrophic attack. Within NATO, continuity assumptions were quietly coordinated but unevenly shared, reflecting disparities in capability and political tolerance for acknowledging doomsday scenarios. These dynamics underscored that continuity planning was not merely a technical exercise, but a political act that defined who would wield authority in the aftermath of catastrophe and under what assumptions. By embedding these answers within classified structures, the Pentagon insulated continuity planning from democratic scrutiny while ensuring its operational readiness, a trade-off deemed necessary in a strategic environment where disclosure itself was considered a vulnerability. As détente waxed and waned, continuity programs persisted largely unchanged, reflecting the enduring belief that improved relations did not eliminate the structural risks posed by nuclear weapons and compressed decision times. In this sense, continuity planning functioned as a stabilizing constant amid shifting diplomatic climates, anchoring U.S. defense posture to worst-case assumptions regardless of rhetorical commitments to peace. The result was a parallel system of governance designed to activate only in extremis but maintained continuously, shaping institutional behavior even in peacetime, and reinforcing a culture in which preparedness for annihilation was treated as a professional obligation rather than an extraordinary contingency. The Pentagon's Doomsday continuity plans thus reveal how the Cold War normalized the expectation of catastrophe within statecraft, embedding survival planning into the architecture of power and altering the implicit meaning of governance in an age where authority had to be capable of enduring the destruction of the society it claimed to represent. As continuity planning became more sophisticated in the 1970s and 1980s, it increasingly reflected a shift from improvisation toward systematization, revealing how the Pentagon sought to transform the survival of governance from an uncertain aspiration into a managed operational problem, even as the underlying assumptions remained profoundly unsettling. Advances in communications technology allowed dispersed command nodes to be linked through hardened, redundant networks designed to function under nuclear attack, reinforcing the belief that authority could be exercised coherently despite massive destruction. Yet these same systems introduce new dependencies on complex infrastructure whose failure could be as catastrophic as the attacks they were meant to withstand. Continuity planners responded by multiplying redundancy, establishing layered chains of command and parallel decision centers that could assume control if others were lost, a strategy that mirrored broader Cold War reliance on redundancy as a hedge against uncertainty. This approach, however, raised difficult questions about coordination and legitimacy, as the existence of multiple potential centers of authority risked fragmentation or conflict if communication degraded or if succession protocols were contested. Within classified exercises, planners grappled with scenarios in which surviving leaders might issue conflicting directives or operate with incomplete information, acknowledging that continuity did not guarantee coherence and that survival of command could coexist with profound dysfunction. The Pentagon addressed these dilemmas through strict proceduralization, codifying decision rules and authority thresholds in advance to minimize discretion under stress, reflecting a preference for predictability, even at the cost of flexibility. These measures underscored how continuity planning sought to replace deliberative governance with algorithmic authority under extreme conditions, prioritizing the rapid execution of pre-planned options over adaptive judgment. The psychological dimension of continuity planning also gained attention as planners recognized that surviving leaders and staff would be required to operate for extended periods in isolated, subterranean, or airborne environments, cut off from civilian society and confronted with the knowledge of widespread destruction. Selection criteria and training emphasized emotional resilience and obedience, anticipating conditions where moral uncertainty and despair could undermine command effectiveness. These preparations reflected an implicit acceptance that post-attack governance would be fundamentally different from peacetime administration, characterized by secrecy, coercion, and the suspension of normal accountability. Continuity planning thus revealed a conception of authority rooted in endurance rather than consent, shaped by the belief that the state's survival required the preservation of command capacity even if its social foundations were destroyed. Arms control developments in the late Cold War, including efforts to limit arsenals and reduce alert levels, did little to alter these assumptions, as continuity planners treated diplomatic progress as reversible and insufficient to eliminate the possibility of sudden decapitation. Instead, continuity programs persisted as a hedge against worst-case scenarios, reflecting a strategic culture that privileged preparedness over optimism and treated catastrophe as an ever-present possibility. The Strategic Defense Initiative and renewed tensions of the early 1980s further reinforced this posture, as uncertainty about future warning times and escalation dynamics, renewed emphasis on leadership survivability, and rapid relocation. Within this environment, continuity planning also influenced how crises were perceived and managed, as the existence of evacuation triggers and dispersal protocols created incentives to act quickly under ambiguous warning, potentially compressing decision-making and increasing reliance on automated systems. This dynamic underscored a subtle but significant effect of continuity planning on Cold War stability, as measures intended to preserve authority could themselves shape escalation pathways by altering the timing and structure of leadership decisions. Secrecy continued to shield these dynamics from public debate, ensuring that citizens remained largely unaware of the extent to which governance had been reimagined around survival under nuclear attack. This invisibility insulated continuity planning from democratic challenge while embedding its assumptions more deeply into institutional practice. By the late 1980s, continuity plans had become both more elaborate and more routinized, maintained through constant rehearsal and revision, even as geopolitical conditions shifted toward de-escalation, reflecting the inertia of systems designed around worst-case thinking. The persistence of these plans illustrated how the Cold War's logic extended beyond confrontation into the architecture of governance itself, shaping how authority was conceived, exercised, and preserved under the shadow of annihilation. In this sense, the Pentagon's Doomsday continuity planning reveals a parallel history of the Cold War, one in which the central problem was not how to win a nuclear war, but how to ensure that someone would remain empowered to command its aftermath, a problem addressed through secrecy, redundancy, and the normalization of catastrophe as an operational assumption rather than an extraordinary failure. These preparations did not guarantee survival, nor did they resolve the moral and political dilemmas inherent in governing after mass destruction, but they defined the boundaries within which Cold War leadership understood its responsibilities, embedding the expectation of continuity amid ruin into the very structure of American defense planning. As the Cold War entered its final phase, the persistence of continuity planning revealed how deeply the expectation of systemic collapse had been woven into U.S. defense governance, shaping not only emergency procedures, but the everyday assumptions under which senior leaders operated, even as diplomatic developments suggested the possibility of reduced nuclear risk. By the late 1980s, continuity of government structures existed as a parallel state apparatus, continuously maintained, updated, and exercised, yet deliberately kept outside public awareness, reflecting a belief that democratic legitimacy and psychological stability depended on shielding society from the full implications of nuclear planning. This duality produced a strategic culture in which officials publicly emphasized deterrence, stability, and arms control, while privately assuming that leadership, survival under apocalyptic conditions, remained a central operational requirement. Within the Pentagon, continuity planning had become inseparable from command and control doctrine, influencing how authority was delegated, how communication networks were prioritized, and how readiness was measured, ensuring that survivability considerations were embedded at every level of strategic planning. The reliance on pre-delegated authority, designed to guarantee response if senior leadership were killed or isolated, underscored the degree to which continuity planning accepted the possibility of fragmented decision-making as preferable to paralysis, even at the risk of unintended escalation. This acceptance reflected a core Cold War assumption that the greatest danger lay in inaction rather than overreaction, shaping continuity frameworks that privileged continuity of force employment over continuity of political deliberation. Exercises conducted under classified continuity scenarios routinely rehearsed the loss of civilian oversight, anticipating a post-attack environment in which military authority would dominate governance by default. A prospect that raised profound constitutional questions that planners acknowledged but could not resolve within existing legal frameworks. Rather than seeking definitive answers, the Pentagon relied on emergency directives and executive authority to bridge gaps between legality and necessity, reinforcing a model of governance grounded in executive continuity rather than representative process. These assumptions were reinforced by intelligence assessments that emphasized the vulnerability of centralized leadership to decapitation strikes, ensuring that continuity planning remained insulated from shifts in diplomatic tone or public sentiment. The collapse of the Soviet Union would later reveal how contingency planning for Doomsday had outlasted the conditions that initially justified it. Yet during the Cold War's closing years, planners continued to operate under the logic that history could reverse abruptly and that preparedness for annihilation remained a professional obligation. The secrecy surrounding continuity programs ensured that their influence on policy remained indirect but pervasive, shaping crisis behavior without being subject to open debate or revision. Analytically, this persistence highlights how the Cold War institutionalized worst-case thinking, embedding the assumption of catastrophe into governance itself, and normalizing preparations for a world in which legitimacy, consent, and accountability would be radically constrained. Continuity planning thus functioned as both a safeguard and a distortion, preserving the capacity to command while redefining what governance would mean under conditions of mass destruction. The tension between survival and legitimacy remained unresolved, deferred into a hypothetical future that planners prepared for but hoped never to inhabit. As the Cold War ended, many continuity structures remained in place, their existence justified by inertia and by the enduring possibility of nuclear threat, illustrating how preparations for Doomsday, once established, were difficult to dismantle. The Pentagon's continuity plans therefore represent one of the most revealing artifacts of Cold War governance, exposing how the nuclear age compelled states to plan not only for war and peace, but for the survival of authority after the collapse of normal political life. These plans demonstrate that deterrence was sustained not merely through weapons and diplomacy, but through the quiet construction of alternative modes of governance designed to function amid ruin, embedding the assumption of catastrophe into the architecture of power. In this final accounting, the Pentagon's Doomsday continuity planning reveals a Cold War defined as much by the management of existential risk as by ideological confrontation, and shows how the anticipation of annihilation reshaped the meaning of state survival, authority, and legitimacy in ways that extended far beyond the battlefield. As continuity planning reached its most mature form in the late Cold War, its ultimate significance lay in how it redefined the concept of national survival, shifting it away from the preservation of population and territory toward the preservation of command authority itself, revealing a strategic logic in which the endurance of decision-making structures was treated as the minimum condition for state existence. Within this framework, the Pentagon's Doomsday preparations assumed that governance could persist even after the destruction of cities, the fragmentation of society, and the collapse of normal economic and legal systems, an assumption that underscored the extent to which nuclear strategy had abstracted survival from lived human reality. Continuity plans were therefore less concerned with rebuilding or recovery than with maintaining the ability to issue orders, control forces, and manage escalation in an environment defined by uncertainty and devastation. This emphasis reflected a Cold War worldview in which the legitimacy of authority was derived not from representation or consent, but from continuity itself, the mere fact of functioning command standing in for democratic mandate when normal politics was assumed to be impossible. Such assumptions were embedded deeply enough that they influenced how leaders thought about crisis management, as the possibility of evacuation, dispersal, and succession shaped decision-making timelines and risk tolerance during moments of heightened tension. The existence of hardened bunkers, airborne command posts, and dispersed leadership nodes created a parallel geography of power, one that privileged survivability over visibility and insulated decision-makers from the immediate consequences of their choices, reinforcing a strategic culture oriented toward endurance rather than accountability. This insulation raised unresolved ethical and political questions about governance after catastrophe, particularly regarding the relationship between surviving authorities and any remaining civilian population. Questions that continuity planning acknowledged only implicitly by focusing on command capacity rather than social legitimacy. The Pentagon's approach reflected a belief that these dilemmas could not be resolved in advance, and that the priority was to ensure that some form of authority existed to confront them if they arose, even if its legitimacy would be contested or provisional. The secrecy surrounding continuity planning ensured that these assumptions remained largely unexamined outside narrow professional circles, preventing broader debate about the implications of preparing to govern amid ruin and allowing planners to treat existential scenarios as technical problems rather than moral ones. In doing so, continuity programs exemplified how the Cold War transformed governance into an engineering challenge, one addressed through redundancy, hardening, and proceduralization rather than public deliberation. As arms control reduced arsenals and rhetoric softened in the late 1980s, continuity planning remained largely unchanged, reflecting institutional skepticism toward the permanence of détente and reinforcing the conviction that preparedness for annihilation was a permanent requirement of nuclear statehood. This persistence highlights how the Cold War's most enduring legacy may not be specific weapon systems or treaties, but the embedding of worst-case assumptions into the structures of governance themselves. Even as the likelihood of nuclear war receded, the architecture built to survive, it continued to shape how authority was conceived and exercised, illustrating the inertia of systems designed around existential threat. In historical perspective, the Pentagon's Doomsday continuity plans reveal a Cold War that extended far beyond crises and confrontations into the foundations of political power, redefining survival as the continuation of command rather than the preservation of society. They demonstrate that the nuclear age compelled states to imagine and prepare for a form of governance stripped to its most coercive and instrumental elements, capable of operating amid destruction but detached from the norms that ordinarily legitimated it. This reimagining of authority was never tested in full, yet its preparation influenced decades of planning, exercises, and institutional behavior, shaping how leaders understood their responsibilities under extreme conditions. In this sense, continuity planning stands as one of the most profound and unsettling adaptations of the Cold War, revealing how the anticipation of annihilation reshaped the meaning of state survival and embedded the assumption of catastrophe into the everyday architecture of power. It underscores that the Cold War was not only a struggle between rival ideologies, but a prolonged confrontation with the possibility that governance itself might have to persist after the end of the world as it had been known. A possibility the Pentagon addressed not through debate or consensus, but through secrecy, structure, and the relentless normalization of Doomsday as an operational problem to be managed rather than a fate to be averted. In its final historical balance, the Pentagon's Doomsday continuity plans stand as one of the most revealing manifestations of Cold War statecraft, not because they promised survival or recovery, but because they exposed how deeply the expectation of catastrophe had been integrated into the logic of governance itself, transforming annihilation from an unthinkable outcome into a condition to be administratively managed. These plans demonstrated that by the height of the nuclear age, the United States no longer defined national survival primarily in terms of population, territory, or civic life, but in terms of the uninterrupted existence of command authority capable of issuing orders, controlling forces, and sustaining the mechanics of state power under conditions of extreme destruction. Continuity planning thus reframed sovereignty as a technical function, maintained through hardened infrastructure, redundant communications, and pre-designated successors, rather than as a political relationship grounded in consent or representation. This reframing reflected the profound distortion imposed by nuclear weapons on traditional concepts of governance, as the speed and scale of potential destruction rendered normal constitutional processes impractical and forced planners to accept that legitimacy might have to be deferred indefinitely in favor of operational control. The secrecy surrounding these preparations was not incidental but essential, as public awareness of the extent to which democratic governance had been subordinated to survival planning risked undermining confidence, provoking resistance, or exposing vulnerabilities, ensuring that continuity programs evolved largely beyond the reach of public accountability. Over decades, these plans shaped institutional behavior, even in peacetime, influencing how authority was centralized, how succession was conceived, and how crises were managed, embedding worst-case assumptions into routine decision-making and reinforcing a culture in which preparedness for annihilation was treated as a permanent responsibility rather than an extraordinary contingency. The endurance of continuity planning through periods of détente, arms control, and eventual superpower collapse illustrates how deeply the Cold War had restructured governance, creating systems that outlasted the conditions that originally justified them, and revealing the inertia of architectures built around existential threat. Analytically, these plans expose a central paradox of the Cold War, that efforts to prevent nuclear war required sustained preparation for governing its aftermath, and that stability was pursued not only through deterrence, but through acceptance of the possibility that deterrence could fail catastrophically. Continuity planning did not resolve the moral, political, or humanitarian dilemmas posed by nuclear war, but it defined the boundaries within which those dilemmas would be confronted, privileging command endurance over social restoration and leaving questions of legitimacy to be addressed, if at all, after survival had been secured. In this sense, the Pentagon's Doomsday plans reveal a Cold War governed as much by fear of internal collapse as by fear of external attack, and show how the anticipation of annihilation reshaped the architecture of power in ways that remain difficult to reconcile with democratic ideals. They demonstrate that the Cold War was not solely a contest of weapons and ideology, but a prolonged experiment in managing the unmanageable, attempting to ensure that authority could persist even if the society it governed was irrevocably shattered. The fact that these plans were never fully tested does not diminish their significance, as their existence influenced behavior, assumptions, and institutional design across decades, shaping how leaders understood survival, responsibility, and control under the shadow of nuclear extinction. In the final accounting, the Pentagon's Doomsday continuity planning stands as a stark reminder that the nuclear age forced states to prepare not only for war and peace, but for the survival of power after catastrophe, embedding the expectation of disaster into the very structure of governance and leaving a legacy that continues to inform how authority, risk, and survival are understood long after the Cold War itself has ended.